Welcome to Mystic Sleep Tales, a place where calm voices and gentle stories help you find a rest. Before we begin tonight, I would love to know where you listening from. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you have settled somewhere soft and comfortable. Take a slow breath now. Let your shoulders ease and allow the day to drift quietly away. My voice will carry you gently back through time to an evening long ago in old London, where the fire burns low and the hours pass like warm, unhurried water. There was a house in a narrow lane not far from the Edgware Road, set a step or two behind a short iron railing that had been painted black so many times over the years that its surface held the gloss and depth of something closer to lacquer than to common paint. The house was one of a terrace, neither the grandest nor the meanest of its neighbors, built of London stock brick that had long since darkened under the steady deposits of soot and damp, so that its original pale yellow had become a solemn, distinguished gray, the kind of gray one sees in the faces of old buildings that have stood through many winters and have learned not to complain about it. A single lamp burned in the front window on this particular evening in January of 1883, its light visible from the pavement as a soft amber glow behind the drawn curtains, faint and steady, like the last ember of a day that had given what it had to give and was content to let the darkness settle in around it. The lane was quiet. It had been quiet for some time. The costermongers who worked the nearby market had long since packed their barrows and wheeled them away into the gathering dusk, their cries of cheap apples and fine potatoes fading into the general murmur of the city as afternoon tilted towards evening. The clerks who lived in the neighboring houses, men of modest station and careful habits, had returned from their offices in the city one by one, their collars turned up against the cold, their boots striking the flagstones with the quick, purposeful rhythm of men eager to be indoors. A few had paused to exchange a word with a neighbor at a doorstep, breath rising in small pale clouds, before ducking inside and drawing their own door shut behind them. By 6 o'clock the lane had emptied entirely, and the only movement was the slow turning of the gas lamps along the pavement, their flames hissing softly within their glass housings as the lamplighter moved from post to post with his long brass pole, touching each wick to life with the unhurried patience of a man performing a ritual so familiar that his hands could accomplish it without the least assistance from his thoughts, that a thin rain had begun to fall sometime in the middle of the afternoon. It had started as the faintest of drizzles, so fine that it was scarcely distinguishable from mist, and a man walking through it might have gone 100 yards before noticing that his coat was damp. But as the hours passed, the rain had thickened and settled, as London rains so often does, into something more deliberate, a steady, vertical fall of small drops that struck the cobblestones with a sound like the tapping of many tiny fingers upon a drum, each one barely audible on its own, but together producing a continuous, gentle percussion that filled the lane from end to end and seemed to press down upon the rooftops with a weight that was less physical than atmospheric, as though the sky itself had lowered a foot or two and was resting its gray chin upon the chimney pots. The cobblestones, wetted now for hours, had taken on a dark, oily shine. Each stone held a trembling miniature of the gas lamp above it, the reflected flames wobbling and stretching with every fresh drop that struck the surface, so that the lane appeared to be lit not only from above, but from below as well. The light caught between the sky and the ground in a soft, double glow that gave the wet pavement the appearance of something living and quietly breathing. The iron railings outside the houses were beaded with droplets that clung to the metal and caught the lamplight before releasing it in tiny, glittering runs that traced their way down the bars and pooled upon the coping stones beneath. In the gutter, a thin stream of water moved with no particular urgency towards the drain at the corner, carrying with it the small debris of the day, a twist of straw, a scrap of brown paper, the stub of a cigar discarded by some passerby who had since gone home and forgotten it entirely. Inside the house, in the front parlor on the ground floor, all of this was inaudible, or nearly so. The rain could be heard, but only as a general murmur, a background presence that was felt rather than listened to, in a way that one feels the proximity of the sea in a coastal town without consciously attending to the sound of the waves. The parlor was a room of modest dimensions, perhaps 12 feet in breadth and 14 in depth, with a ceiling that, by the standards of the day, was neither impressively high nor uncomfortably low, but simply appropriate, the kind of ceiling that neither oppresses nor inspires, but allows the occupant to forget it is there, which is perhaps the best thing a ceiling can do. The walls were papered in a pattern that had been fashionable some 15 or 20 years earlier, a repeating design of small, stylized leaves in tones of green and gold upon a ground of deep cream. The paper had faded somewhat near the window, where the afternoon sun caught it during the summer months, but elsewhere it retained enough of its original warmth to give the room a sense of deliberate, if modest, taste, the taste of someone who had chosen carefully within his means, and then had the good sense to leave well alone. Below the dado rail, which ran the circumference of the room at the height of a man's waist, the lower portion of the wall was painted in a shade of brown so dark as to be nearly indistinguishable from the oak of the skirting boards, and this darker band gave the room a feeling of groundedness, of solidity, as though the lower half of the space were anchored firmly to the earth while the upper half aspired, in its quiet, unpretentious way, towards something a little lighter. The floor was covered by a Brussels carpet whose pattern of deep crimson and green had been trodden over so many years that its original sharpness had softened into something gentler, more harmonious, the colors having spent a long time in one another's company and having arrived, at last, a state of peaceful coexistence that made the carpet look less like a manufactured thing and more like something that had grown there naturally, the way moss grows upon a stone. A fire had been laid in the grate early that afternoon and had been burning since with the patient, steady warmth of a fire that has passed beyond the restless stage of youth, beyond the crackling and leaping and showing off, and has settled into the deep, companionable heat of maturity. The coals were good Wallsend coals, delivered only the week before by a man with a cart and a boy with a sack, and they had been selected and arranged in the grate with the quiet competence of someone who understood that a fire, like a friendship, requires not grand gestures, but consistent, modest attention. They glowed now with a deep, even warmth, the kind that no longer demands to be noticed, but simply radiates outward in broad, invisible waves, pressing gently against the curtains drawn across the window, warming the brass of the fender, reaching into the far corners of the room where the gaslight did not quite penetrate, and laying a mantle of heat across the shoulders and knees of anyone who sat within its generous circle. The grate itself was of cast iron, set within a surround of dark slate that had been polished to a soft, uncertain luster, and the fireplace as a whole occupied the center of the wall opposite the window, as fireplaces in houses of this kind always did, serving as the room's principal point of focus. its warmth and light drawing the eye and the body towards it in the way that a hearth has drawn human beings since the very beginning of shelter. Above the grate, the mantelpiece of the same dark slate ran the breadth of the chimney breast, and upon its surface stood the small, familiar company of objects that had occupied those same positions for so many years that they had become almost invisible to anyone who lived in the house, and yet which together composed a kind of portrait of the life conducted there, as intimate and revealing in their way as any photograph or written record. To the center of the mantelpiece stood a clock. It was not a grand clock, nor an especially valuable one. Its case was of black marble, squat and solid, with a round white face behind a circle of glass, and the hours picked out in Roman numerals that had yellowed very faintly with age, like the pages of a book that has been opened many times but never carelessly handled. The clock's mechanism was sound, and it kept time with a reliability that its owner had long since ceased to remark upon, in the same way that one ceases to remark upon the rising of the sun or the return of the seasons, not from ingratitude, but from the deeper form of trust that comes when a thing has proved itself so consistently that doubt becomes impossible. It ticked with a sound so familiar that it had passed beyond the category of sound altogether and had become instead a kind of texture within the silence, a gentle, rhythmic pulsing that lay beneath all other noises like the heartbeat of the house itself, marking the passage of each second with a small, precise, unhurried affirmation that time was continuing and that there was no cause for alarm. To the left of the clock stood a pair of Staffordshire spaniels, their ceramic coats a warm reddish brown, their ears curling in gentle, painted waves, their eyes turned slightly outward so that each appeared to gaze into a different corner of the room, as though between them they had the whole of the parlor under careful surveillance. They had been a wedding gift, these spaniels, from a sister who lived in Shropshire and who had chosen them, one supposes, with the thought that they would bring a touch of warmth and domesticity to a new household. And in this she had succeeded beyond what she might have imagined, for though the fashion for such ornaments had long since passed among those who troubled themselves with fashion, the spaniels remained in their appointed places year after year, steadfast and unperturbed, like two sentinels who had forgotten what it was they had been set to guard, but saw no reason, on that account, to abandon the post. To the right of the clock, a small glass dome covered a spray of wax flowers, their petals still holding the faint blush of color with which they had been fashioned, though the years had given them a softness, a kind of gentle dimming, that made them look less like imitations of nature and more like memories of it, as though they were not representations of flowers, but rather the impression that flowers leave upon the mind long after the season has turned and the garden has gone to sleep. Beside the dome stood a brass candlestick bearing a half-burned taper of beeswax, its wick blackened and slightly curled, unlit this evening, for the gaslight mounted upon the wall above the mantelpiece provided illumination enough. The gas flame was turned low, as was the habit of the house on quiet evenings, so that the light it offered was less an illumination than a suggestion, a warm amber presence that did not so much dispel the shadows as reach an understanding with them, allowing each its place and asking only that the center of the room, where the fire burned and the chair stood, be kept in gentle clarity. The room was furnished with the unpretentious solidity that characterized so many London parlors of its kind. Against the wall to the left of the door stood a bookcase of dark oak, not tall, reaching only to the height of a man's shoulder, but deep and well filled with volumes whose spines had the comfortable, slightly bowed look of books that are read and returned to their places and read again, rather than books kept for the impression they might make upon a visitor. The titles, had one been able to read them in this light, ran to history and natural philosophy, to volumes of verse both English and classical, and to one or two novels that had been popular a decade earlier, and had since settled into the dignified obscurity of books that are no longer discussed in society, but still quietly cherished by those who discovered them when they were new and who see no reason to set aside a companion simply because the rest of the world has moved on. A small footstool, upholstered in needlework that was beginning to show its years, sat before the bookcase, placed there for the convenience of reaching the upper shelf, though it had not been moved in some months, and had acquired the settled, rooted appearance of furniture that has found its permanent home and has no intention of being displaced. Opposite the bookcase, in the corner nearest the fire, stood an armchair. It was a large chair, wider and deeper than fashion now recommended, with a high back and broad arms and a seat that had been occupied so often and for so long that it had molded itself, with the slow, patient accommodation of old leather, to the precise shape of its usual occupant, so that the chair, when empty, bore the faint impression of the man who sat in it, a kind of ghost of comfort, visible in the way the cushion dipped and the arms were worn smooth and the leather at the back held a gentle curve that corresponded exactly to the curve of a particular spine. The upholstery was of a dark burgundy color, cracked in places along the arms where hands had rested through many hundreds of evenings, and the seat cushion had been supplemented at some point with a smaller cushion of tapestry work, not for decoration, but for the genuine, practical comfort of a back that appreciated the additional support and was in no mood to pretend otherwise. A woolen shawl, folded but not neatly, lay across one arm of the chair, available for those moments when the fire's warmth seemed insufficient or when the occupant simply wished for the particular reassurance that a familiar weight upon the shoulders can provide. Heavy curtains of dark green velvet, lined with a paler fabric to keep out the cold, hung at the single window that faced the street, drawn close together so that only the thinnest seam of outside darkness was visible between them. Before the window, on a small round table of the kind that was to be found in nearly every parlor of the period, stood a paraffin lamp, its brass base polished to a soft luster, its glass chimney clear and clean. It was a lamp kept in reserve for those evenings when the gas supply faltered, as it did with a regularity that the gas company found difficult to explain and impossible to prevent, and for those rare occasions when the occupant of the house preferred the quieter, steadier, more intimate light that a well-trimmed paraffin lamp could provide, a light that did not hiss or flicker but burned with the calm, self-contained assurance of a flame that knows exactly what is expected of it and has no ambition beyond doing its work well. In the chair by the fire, on this particular evening, sat a man. He was not young, though he was not yet what one would call old. He was in that middle territory of life, somewhere past 50, but not yet within sight of 60, the years having done their work upon him with a steady hand, but not an unkind one. His hair, which had once been dark, had passed through the stage of graying at the temples and had arrived at that general, indeterminate shade between brown and gray that descends upon men by such gradual degrees that they are often the last to notice it, discovering it only when they catch sight of themselves unexpectedly in a shop window or a looking-glass and are startled, briefly, by the stranger who looks back. His face was clean-shaven, as was customary among men of his station, and it bore the particular expression of a person who is not engaged in any specific thought, but is not, for that reason, unhappy, the face of a man at rest, unguarded and undirected, the lines of the day already beginning to smooth themselves from his forehead as the warmth of the fire and the stillness of the room did their quiet, restorative work. He wore a dark woolen waistcoat over a shirt of white cotton, the collar loosened, and trousers of a dark, serviceable material that bore no particular distinction but were clean and well maintained. His feet, extended towards the fire in their thick woolen stockings, were crossed at the ankle, and his boots, a pair of sturdy leather boots that showed the honest were of daily use, had been removed and placed beside the parlor door when he came in from his last errand of the afternoon. Set there with the careful alignment of a man who has lived alone long enough to find satisfaction in small domestic rituals, and who knows that a pair of boots, properly placed, is a pair of boots that will be found where it is wanted in the morning without the need for searching. He had eaten his supper an hour earlier. It had been a simple meal, a plate of cold mutton left by the housekeeper before she departed for the evening, with bread and butter and a cup of strong tea, and he had consumed it standing in the kitchen, as was his habit when dining alone, leaning against the edge of the table with the plate in one hand and the cup within easy reach upon the counter. There was nothing melancholy in this arrangement. He did not eat standing because he was in a hurry or because he lacked a proper dining table, for there was one in the room behind the parlor, covered with a cloth and set with a single place that the housekeeper laid each morning with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understands that routines, however small, are the threads from which the fabric of a life is made. He ate standing simply because he preferred it, because a man alone in a kitchen on a winter evening finds something honest and uncomplicated in the act of eating simply and without ceremony, and because the sooner the plate was washed and the cup dried, and both returned to their places upon the rack beside the sink, the sooner he could make his way through to the parlor and settle himself in his chair by the fire, which was, on evenings such as this, the only destination that mattered. He had stirred the fire upon entering the parlor, lifting the poker from its place in the brass companion stand beside the fender, and turning the coals with 3 slow, deliberate strokes, each one releasing a brief shower of sparks that rose and faded within the space of a breath. Then he had taken 3 fresh pieces of coal from the scuttle, a handsome copper vessel of the helmet variety, its surface darkened to a rich, uneven patina by years of proximity to the fire, and he had placed them upon the glowing bed with the careful precision of a man adding the final stones to a wall, each piece chosen for its size and shape, and set in the position where it would burn most steadily and contribute most usefully to the general warmth. The poker had been returned to its stand, the scuttle lid replaced, and then he had lowered himself into the chair with the deep, slow, involuntary sigh of a body releasing the accumulated tension of the day, a sound that was less an expression of weariness than of arrival, the sound a man makes when he has at last reached the place where he is most fully and most comfortably himself. The poker stood now in its accustomed place in the brass stand, alongside a small shovel and a pair of tongs, the 3 of them forming that companionable trio known to every household that kept a coal fire, and which was referred to, with the quiet understatement typical of the age, as a companion set. The fender, a low, curved barrier of pierced brass, ran along the front of the hearth in a gentle arc, its purpose to prevent any stray ember from escaping onto the carpet, though its decorative perforations and softly gleaming surface gave it an air of ornament as well as function. The hearth tiles, laid in a pattern of dark blue and cream, were clean and uncracked, and the fire irons that stood upon them cast long, flickering shadows that moved with the breathing of the coals, stretching and contracting in slow, hypnotic rhythm. The man had no book open upon his lap this evening. There were evenings for reading, evenings when he would take down a volume from the bookcase and settle into its pages for an hour or two, following the argument of some historian or losing himself in the rhythms of a favorite poet, and those evenings had their own particular pleasure. But there were other evenings, and this was one of them, when no book was wanted, when the simple act of sitting by the fire and allowing the warmth and the stillness and the steady rhythm of the clock to do what no printed page could accomplish was enough. More than enough, was in fact the truest and most necessary form of rest that a man could find at the end of a day that had been, in its quiet way, full. His eyes were half closed. Not in sleep, not yet, but in that particular state of drowsiness that occupies the borderland between waking and dreaming, a state in which the mind is no longer directed but has not yet surrendered, and the thoughts that pass through it are not so much thoughts as sensations, impressions, fragments of image and feeling that drift across the surface of consciousness like clouds reflected in still water. He was aware of the fire. He was aware of the clock. He was aware of the rain, falling steadily against the window glass with a sound that was less a sound than a presence, a companion that had been with him all evening and that asked nothing of him but his continued existence in the chair. From somewhere deeper in the house, from the kitchen perhaps, came the faint, irregular drip of a tap that had not been turned quite firmly enough. He knew this sound well. It was one of those small domestic imperfections that he had intended to remedy on several occasions and had never quite managed, and which had in the meantime become so much a part of the house's nightly music that he would have missed it sorely had it stopped. The drip fell at uneven intervals, sometimes 2 drops in quick succession, then a long pause, then a single drop, as though the tap, like the man in the chair, was drowsing and could not quite find a steady rhythm. Together with the ticking of the clock and the sound of the rain and the low, steady breathing of the fire, it formed a kind of quiet composition, each element playing its own unhurried part in a piece of music that had no written score and no appointed conductor, but that continued, note by gentle note, through the hours of the evening and into the reaches of the night. The gaslight on the wall above the mantelpiece gave a thin, continuous hiss, barely perceptible, the particular signature of gas lamps in the homes of that period, when the pressure in the mains was never entirely constant, and the flame would flicker and resettle with the gentle, ceaseless restlessness of something not wholly tamed. The light it cast moved very slightly upon the walls, so that the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting by the smallest possible degree, as though the room itself were a living thing at rest, its slow respiration matched to the rhythm of the fire below. The man registered these movements without attending to them. They were part of the room, as much as the wallpaper and the carpet and the chair, and they required no more notice than the beating of his own heart, which continued its steady work without supervision or applause. Upon the wall opposite the fireplace hung a single picture in a gilt frame. It was a print, not an original painting, and it depicted a scene of no particular ambition or distinction, a lane between hedgerows in some unnamed corner of the English countryside, with a church tower visible in the distance and a sky of soft, unconvincing blue overhead. The man had inherited this picture along with the house, and though he had never felt any strong attachment to it, neither had he felt any impulse to take it down, and so it remained year after year in its place upon the wall, gazing out upon the room with a mild, placid expression of a scene that has nothing urgent to communicate, but is content simply to be looked at, or not looked at, as the occasion demands. Beside it, in a smaller frame of dark wood, hung a photograph, somewhat faded now, of a woman seated in a garden, her face partly obscured by the shadow of a bonnet, one hand resting upon the arm of a wicker chair. The photograph had been taken many years ago, in a garden that no longer existed, on an afternoon that belonged now to a different life, and the man did not look at it this evening, though he was aware of it, as he was always aware of it, with the particular awareness that one has for things that are both precious and painful, and which one has learned, over the slow course of years, to carry without constantly examining, the way one carries a stone in a pocket, knowing it is there by its weight and its warmth, but not needing to take it out and hold it to the light. The fire shifted. A coal that had been balanced upon the crest of the pile slipped with a soft, grating sound and settled into the bed of embers below, sending up a small, brief spray of sparks that climbed an inch or two into the warm air above the grate before winking out, each one a tiny, momentary star that blazed and died in the space between one breath and the next. The man's eyes, which had been nearly closed, opened a fraction at the sound, tracked the last of the sparks as they rose and faded, and then settled once more into their half-lidded repose, satisfied that nothing required his attention, that the fire was doing what fires do, and the night was doing what nights do, and the only thing asked of him was to remain where he was, in the warmth and the stillness, and to allow the evening to continue at its own unhurried pace. His hands lay upon the arms of the chair, fingers slightly curled, perfectly relaxed. They were the hands of a man who had spent his working life in an office of some kind, hands that were accustomed to the pen rather than the plow, their surfaces smooth except where the years had laid down calluses in the particular places where a pen is held and where the edge of a desk meets the wrist. They were not young hands, but neither were they frail. They lay upon the worn leather with the easy weight of things that have found a proper resting place and have no inclination to move. The clock on the mantelpiece struck the quarter hour with a single, clear note, so soft and so unhurried that it seemed less a sound than a thought that had occurred to the room itself and then dissolved, leaving the silence afterwards faintly richer, faintly deeper, the way silence always is after a sound has passed through it and moved on. The man stirred, but only to shift his weight more deeply into the chair, settling himself as one settles into a familiar bed, with the knowledge that everything is arranged as it should be and that nothing more is required until morning. Outside, the rain continued. It fell with the same steady, unvarying patience it had maintained for hours, as though it had been given a single, simple task and intended to complete it without haste, without faltering, and without calling any particular attention to itself. The cobblestones of a lane would be gleaming now beneath the gas lamps, each stone holding a small, trembling reflection of a light above, and the gutters would be running with thin, quiet streams that found their way to the drains with the purposeful unhurriedness of water that knows where it is going and sees no reason to arrive before its time. The man in the chair thought of none of this. Or rather, He thought of it in the way that a man thinks when he is no longer directing his thoughts, but merely allowing them to pass through him, like light through glass, leaving a faint warmth but no lasting impression. He thought, if it could be called thinking, of the particular sensation of heat upon the soles of his stockinged feet, where the fire's warmth was most concentrated and most welcome. He thought of the weight of the shawl that he had drawn across his lap at some point without quite remembering when he had done so, its wool familiar against his hands. He thought, in some vague and unexamined way, of the sound the rain made upon the glass, and of how it resembled, distantly and without any clear reason, the sound of rice being poured slowly from one vessel into another, a sound he had heard once in a shop many years ago, and which had lodged itself in some corner of his memory for no reason he could name or wish to investigate. The fire gave a long, low, settling sound, a deep exhalation of heat and weight as the coals adjusted themselves within the grate, finding new positions of equilibrium after the small disturbance of the fallen piece. It was one of those sounds that a coal fire makes when it has been burning for many hours and has passed beyond the stage of effort into a kind of deep, meditative burning, where the heat is no longer being produced so much as released steadily and without urgency from reserves that seem, at such moments, inexhaustible. The cast-iron grate radiated a warmth of its own, a drier, more metallic heat than the heat of the coals themselves, and the slates around, which had been absorbing warmth all evening in its slow, patient way, now returned it to the room in broad, invisible waves that could be felt upon the face and the backs of the hands and the closed eyelids of anyone who sat within its reach. The man felt this warmth as one feels the warmth of the sun through a window on a winter afternoon, a warmth that seems to come not from any single source, but from everywhere at once, surrounding and supporting and asking nothing in return. It was the warmth of a room that had been inhabited and cared for, a warmth that carried within it the accumulated comfort of all the evenings that had preceded this one, all the fires that had burned in this same grate, all the quiet hours that had been spent in this same chair, until the very walls seemed to hold within them a memory of shelter that went deeper than plaster and brick, deeper than the house itself, reaching back to whatever ancient, unnamed impulse first led human beings to build an enclosure around a flame and call a home. A carriage passed in the street outside. The sound of it arrived from the distance, the dull, rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves muffled by the wet cobblestones, the hiss of the wheels through standing water, the faint creak of the carriage springs as the vehicle swayed over the uneven ground. It passed the house, the sounds growing momentarily louder, then fainter still, until they dissolved entirely into the rain and the night, leaving behind a silence that was somehow deeper than the one the carriage had interrupted, as though the passage of the sound had carved a space in the air that the stillness now rushed to fill. The man registered this without fully hearing it. The sound passed through his consciousness the way a fish passes through water, briefly displacing what is there and then moving on, leaving the surface undisturbed. He was too far along the road towards sleep to be recalled by something so ordinary as a carriage in the street. The room held him. The fire held him. The chair, with its years of patient accommodation to his shape and his weight, held him. And the evening itself, with its rain and its warmth and its steady, gentle sounds, held him in the way that only a familiar evening in a familiar room can hold a person, with a tenderness that asks nothing and gives everything and makes the passage of time feel not like something lost, but like something deepened, a settling into the truest and most restful part of the night. The clock ticked on, the rain fell on, the fire breathed on, and the shadows in the corners of the room continued their slow, unhurried dance, expanding and contracting with the flickering of the gaslight, keeping time with the breathing of the coals, and the breathing of the man, and the breathing of the old house itself, all of them moving together in a rhythm so slow and so deep that it could not be heard, only felt, like the turning of the earth beneath the floorboards, patient and sure and immeasurably old. His breathing had grown deeper. His chest rose and fell with the even, unhurried cadence of a man who has crossed the border between wakefulness and the country that lies just beyond it, that warm and welcoming country where the concerns of the day have no passport and cannot follow. His shoulders, which had carried through the afternoon the particular tension that belongs to a man who has attended to matters of modest but real consequence, had surrendered themselves entirely to the cushioned back of the chair, sinking into it as though they had remembered, at last, that they were not required to hold anything up, that the day had done its work and the evening had taken over, and the only duty remaining was the oldest and most forgiving duty of all, which is simply to rest. His jaw had relaxed. His lips had parted very slightly. The lines upon his forehead, the small creases that the hours had drawn there like pencil marks upon a page, had smoothed themselves away, erased by the warmth and the silence and the slow, irresistible pull of sleep, leaving his face as calm and unmarked as a field after snow, open and undefended and at peace with whatever the night might bring. He was thinking of nothing now, or he was thinking of everything and nothing at once, which is the particular kind of thinking that belongs to the last minutes before sleep, when a mind releases its grip upon the world and allows the accumulated impressions of the day to drift and settle without supervision, arranging themselves into patterns that have more to do with feeling than with reason, more to do with the body's deep, ancient wisdom than with the mind's restless, chattering need to understand. Fragments of the day passed through him like the shadows of clouds passing over a field. The face of a colleague, the sound of a door closing, the taste of tea, the particular quality of the light in his office at 3:30, when a winter sun finds a narrow path between the buildings opposite and lays a brief, pale finger of gold across the papers on his desk before withdrawing again into the gray. None of these impressions lingered. Each arrived, was briefly held in the fading light of consciousness, and then released, drifting downward into the deeper waters where memory and dream are indistinguishable from one another, and where the boundaries between this evening and all other evenings, this fire and all other fires, this room and all other rooms in which a man has ever sat and been at peace, dissolve into a single, encompassing warmth. The candle on the mantelpiece, unlit, cast no shadow. The wax flowers beneath their glass dome caught the firelight and seemed, for a moment, to tremble, as though some faint breath of air had passed across their petals, though no air stirred in that close, warm room. The Staffordshire Spaniels kept their painted vigil, one looking east and one looking west, patient and unchanging, their ceramic eyes reflecting the glow of the embers with a faint, warm glint that gave them, in this light, an almost living quality, as though they too were drowsing at their posts and might, if left undisturbed, close their painted eyes and sleep. The photograph on the wall looked out from its frame with the quiet patience it had always shown, asking nothing, offering only the memory of a summer afternoon in a garden where the roses had been in bloom and the light had fallen just so, and where a woman whose face was half in shadow had rested her hand upon the arm of a chair and had been, for that one captured instant, entirely and completely present. The man did not look at the photograph. He did not need to. It was there, as it was always there, and its presence was enough, a fixed point in the room's familiar geography, as constant as the clock and as silent as the flowers under glass. The fire burned lower. The coals, which had been glowing with a broad, even heat, had begun their slow contraction, the outer edges of each piece darkening to gray, while the center held its deep orange warmth, so that the bed of the fire now resembled a small landscape of hills and valleys, each ridge outlined in fading light, each hollow filled with shadow. The heat was still considerable, still more than sufficient to warm the room and the man within it, but it had acquired a different quality, a quieter, more inward warmth, the warmth of embers rather than flames, of a fire that is settling in for the long hours of the night and is content to give what it has without replenishment, steadily and without complaint, until the last coal cools and the grate grows cold in the gray light of morning. The man's eyelids, which had been half closed for some time, now closed entirely. The thin thread of awareness that had kept him tethered to the room, to the sound of the clock and the rain and the fire, stretched, thinned, and at last dissolved, so gently that there was no moment at which one could say, "There, that was the instant he crossed over." It was more like a deepening of the stillness that had been gathering around him all evening, a final, imperceptible settling, the way a stone sinks the last fraction of an inch into soft earth and comes to rest. He slept. The fire burned on. The clock ticked on. The rain fell on. And the room, that small, warm, lamplit room in a narrow lane just off the Edgware Road, continued to hold its occupant in the same steady, patient embrace with which it had held him on so many evenings before, offering nothing more and nothing less than the simplest and most ancient of comforts. A place to be warm, a place to be still, and a place, when the day is done and the fire burns low and the rain falls softly against the glass, to rest. Outside, the great city of London went about its vast and complicated business, carriages rolling through the wet streets, constables pacing their beats beneath dripping capes, the river sliding dark and slow beneath its bridges. But here, in this room, none of that mattered. Here, there was only the fire and the chair and the man and the rain, each one content to be exactly what it was and nothing more, and together forming a circle of warmth and stillness and rest that the cold night outside could press against but never breach. The coals settled once more, a long, slow, almost inaudible adjustment that produced no sparks this time, only a soft, deep sound like a contented sigh as the fire eased itself more deeply into its own warmth. The embers pulsed with a glow that would last for hours yet, steady and unhurried, requiring neither attention nor encouragement, burning down at their own patient pace, giving their heat into a room that had already absorbed more warmth than it needed and was simply holding it now, keeping it safe against the cold and the dark, the way one keeps a promise. The quarter hour chimed once more, that single, unhurried note, and this time the man did not stir. He was beyond the reach of clocks now, beyond the rain and the fire and the ticking of time. carried upon the slow, warm current of sleep into that country where the light is softer and the air is warmer, and the only sound is the sound of one's own breathing, deep and steady and free from every care. And the room waited, as rooms do, patient and unchanging, its corners dark and its center warm, its mantelpiece keeping its small collection of treasures, its bookcase holding its patient volumes, its curtains drawn against the night. It waited with the particular patience of a room that has seen many evenings and will see many more, a room that asks nothing of the hours but their quiet passing, and which offers, in return, the most necessary of gifts. A place to be warm, a place to be safe, and a place when the world is cold and the rain is falling and the fire is burning low, to sleep. Thank you, very sincerely, for spending this quiet evening here with us at Mystic Sleep Tales. If this story has helped carry you a little closer to rest, you are always welcome to return. You might, if you wish, leave a gentle word below, or share this with someone who could use a calm place to settle in tonight. But there is no hurry and no expectation. Sleep well, wherever you are. Good night.